So even though I'm perfectly comfortable using my Shopsmith as a table saw, over the years, a lot of people commented that they didn't like some of the deficiencies of it. Now, what are the deficiencies? Well, even though you can add a table system and fence system like you see back here, that seems to only handle the width of the support. Yes, there are things you can do to pick up some additional rear support, but overall, the table is shallow. Also, it's tall. As a table saw, it's a very tall table saw. There are some folks that just don't like that. Likewise, even people that love their Shopsmith sometimes grow into a bigger space and decide they want to dedicate a table saw for regular everyday use. So to address that, in the early 1990s, Shopsmith introduced this solution right here. And what is this, you might ask? Well, this is the SawSmith 2000 table saw. Let's pan down a moment so you can see and take it all in. The SawSmith 2000. Now that name harkens back to the name of a radial arm saw that was manufactured by Magna and Yuba and again Magna Engineering. And that saw went away. And the name of the product, though, remained as a licensed trademark by Shopsmith. So when they came up with this table saw, they said, well, let's bring back the name SawSmith. And the saw was available in 4 variations, a small version just like I have here, but with a simpler fence system. This is the same fence as the Mark V Model 510 with tubular ways on the front. They also had a larger version of that saw available, but what you see here behind me is a version with an Excalibur fence system available in a small and a large. I happen to own the small one. So with the Excalibur fence system, a proven fence does an excellent job for ripping and for ripping sheet goods, in fact. But what makes the SawSmith 2000 so unique isn't so much that as this. That's right. With the pull of a knob on the front of the machine, I am able to do cross-cutting with the lumber remaining stationary. In fact, while I can slide the miter gauge in the T-slot, they have a little stop that was provided that goes into that slot, locks down, and holds the miter gauge in place so that your stock is held firmly in place while you make your crosscuts. Now, this comes in really handy when you're talking about long boards. Imagine trimming a little bit off the end of a 2x10, for example. Instead of sliding the board through the table saw, we can move the blade. Now, this is very much like a radial arm saw. It's very much like a chop saw of today, which may be part of the reason why this innovative design didn't catch on. However, now it's funny, there are a couple modern saws made in Europe today that have this exact same feature. And it's funny to see people comment on those videos saying, well, this is nothing new. You should check out the Shopsmith SawSmith 2000. Theirs predates this by a mile. Well, come on, we got to be a little humble about this. Let me pull this one aside and show you something. This machine is the Craftsman builder's saw, and this saw has the exact same feature, the ability to do cross-cutting without moving the stock. Now, what's weird about this one is instead of reaching down and pulling a handle, instead you're reaching up to the saw guard and pulling a handle. I don't have the saw guard attached, so you can see the saw guard here doubles as your splitter as well as your handle for drawing it through. It has a fence for making your rip cuts, and it has a really interesting miter gauge that we'll have to take a look at in a future date. But this one doesn't slide in the miter slot, but instead is bolted through a series of holes in the tabletop that allows it to lock very accurately into commonly used angles. Now, it has another interesting feature, and that is this machine was designed to be set on the slab or on the foundation of the home, and to have the home built around it using the saw, and then carried out the front door by two people. The front edge of this is rolled in such a way to make it very comfortable to lift and carry this right out the front door of the home that was built with it. So that's part of the gimmick of the builder saw. This one was made in probably the late 40s, early 50s. So we got to say that, you know, Shopsmith got beat by at least this saw. But then there's other folks that will point out there was a company called Henniker, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong too, who sold a machine called the versatile saw. Now, the versatile saw was introduced in 1947. That's the same year that Magna Engineering introduced the Shopsmith 10ER. So you have to say that Henniker beat even Craftsman to the party with a sliding table or sliding blade table saw. But wait, not so fast. What about this saw? Yeah, this is yet an earlier Craftsman builder's saw with many of the same features of its little brother back here. This was introduced, I have an owner's manual for this one, in 1940. So, okay, the versatile saw, around a long time, not around as long as the original Craftsman builder saw. So this one's the granddaddy of them all, right? No, actually, I found patents going back into the 1800s for table saws with sliding blades. So we have to humbly say we at Shopsmith back in the 1990s were standing on the shoulders of giants. So let's get back to the SawSmith 2000, shall we? So I want to give a shout out to Chad Nevels for helping me save this. I was contacted by a woman around Lima, Ohio, who saw my blog and said, "Can you help me out?" And her husband had passed, and he had a bunch of Shopsmith tools, and she needed some help figuring out their value. It's like, this is really going to be difficult from this distance. Let me talk to my buddy Chad at Dayton, Ohio, and see if he can help you out. So Chad traveled up to Lima a couple times to help guide her in setting a price on the various things, at which point I made an offer on a couple items and ended up with the SawSmith 2000. Now, the previous owner did some weird things to this machine. For one thing, he mounted this piece of tubing, which I'm not sure why it's there. It doesn't hold the miter gauge very well, so I don't think that's it, although maybe that is it. But as you can see, I'm putting a T-handle Allen wrench into that, and that's something that I need for this machine to do a bunch of things, just as we do with Shopsmith tools. While it has a guard that's very similar to the 510, 520, it does have a major difference here in the anti-kickback cams, and that is when we're making a crosscut with this saw, that anti-kickback cam wants to get caught, so you're pulling it through the wood, and then you're going to push it back, and it won't push back. So we had to lift the cams up and out of the way whenever we make a crosscut, always remembering to put them back down when you're going to rip with this saw. It has the ability to tilt to 45 degrees, and in order to do that, we loosen this bevel lock, it says right on it, and then you can see just the weight of the saw itself makes it want to drop to different angles. There is a stop that we can set to lock that in at 45 degrees. There's a stop we can set to bring it back to 90, and then that locks in place. Also on the front, we have the ability to raise and lower our blade by turning this crank. And then there's one more thing that's important to know, and that is when ripping stock, it might be more convenient to have that blade centered. And so there is a marking on the table insert that says center. I can bring the blade forward at any point and lock that knob, and that will lock that blade right there, making it a bit more convenient for some cuts. The Excalibur fence slides effortlessly. This one needs a little bit of work, a little bit of cleaning primarily. And there's one challenge with the Excalibur fence. The way it works is you're pulling a block on the back that pulls against the back rail and pulls this front mount tight against the front rail when we drop the handle. Now that works great as long as there's something holding those rails apart. The challenge is if you're making a cut right here where you have no table infill, it's possible sometimes, I haven't checked this saw, yeah, there's a little bit of play. So that needs to be filled in as far as I'm concerned, and thankfully that's relatively easy to do. So we're going to make a cut here on this piece of cherry. I'm going to remove the fence, and this fence, as you can see, it locks by pushing the lever down, it unlocks by raising the lever up, and then it disconnects by raising the lever all the way up. And with that, the fence lifts right off. And let's make a cut. We'll just trim the end of this piece off. Nice clean cut. So you might be asking yourself, it's kind of a cool saw. Why didn't it take off? Well, it is kind of cool, but it falls short in a couple areas. Some of the things were outside of Shopsmith's control. For example, at the time that this was introduced, the Taiwanese tools were all hitting the market, such as Jet, Grizzly, Reliant. Even Delta was starting to dabble and eventually went all in on the Asian-made tools. Some of the things were within Shopsmith's control. The engineer that designed this thing kind of did it in a little bit of a vacuum, didn't get input from some knowledgeable woodworkers at the company, and did some things that kind of fell short. For example, the top table, the main table, is flush with the end of the cabinet on both sides. Meaning if you had any fixtures that you were traditionally clamping onto the table, you couldn't. Things like a cove cutting fence, which I used to do quite frequently back in the day. The base of this is just sheet metal, so it's a little bit wobbly. The depth of cut for a 10-inch saw is about the lowest of any 10-inch, the thickness is the least of any 10-inch saw I've ever used. The cross-cutting capability, even with this neat sliding feature, was only about 10 inches, and this is me going off of memory here. It also had some problems in the mechanism itself. Initially, the very first run, as you pulled the blade forward, if you put any body English on this handle, the blade would move in the slot. And in fact, the blade does move in the slot a little bit as the blade gets to the highest setting. And the lowest setting. And in fact, speaking of the lowest setting doesn't drop it all the way below the insert, meaning zero clearance inserts were a challenge to produce. Oh, there's so many things. We're gonna have to talk about this in the follow-up video, and there'll probably be another video even beyond that at some point, showing some best practices for the use of the saw if you happen to own one. Am I recommending you buy one? No. Unless you are a Shopsmith junkie with so much extra space that you don't know what to do with, I would suggest the SawSmith 2000 is probably not the table saw for you. I like it. I'm glad to have another one. I sold mine back in the 90s, but I don't recommend it. But I'm curious to hear what you think. As always, channel members, thank you for your patience and for your support. I'll see you about midweek for a Q&A, and in the meantime, make it a great day.